So this week we're going to be looking at some basic ecology concepts as it applies to the marine environment. So some of this is going to be a review, again, from your biology classes. Other things might be a little bit new. So the word ecology, it literally means the study of the home. So when we say ecology, we're talking about home. Ecology is centered around living things and their environment. So how living things interact with their environment is basically what ecologists look into. All organisms are part of what's called an ecosystem. So an ecosystem is basically the living things and all of the non-living things that affect it and how they interact with each other. If we take all of the ecosystems on Earth and combine them, we have the biosphere. So for example, you have, like my little gecko lizard here lounging on his couch. Let's take this lizard. Let's say that he is our example of an organism. He lives in an ecosystem. Now, his natural ecosystem does not include a lounge chair, but you get the idea. So his ecosystem might be, in his case, let's say he lives in the desert, so his ecosystem would be a desert ecosystem. There's many ecosystems that make up Earth, so that would include a desert, ocean ecosystems, forests, chaparral, tundra. Those are all examples of different ecosystems when combined make up the biosphere. So when we talk about energy in the biosphere and how it moves through the system, we start, of course, with the sun, unless we're talking about hydrothermal vents, in which case we're talking about the vents as the source of energy, but we'll get to that a little bit later. On the surface, we depend on the sun as our sole source of energy. The sun is the origin of that energy, and producers, which includes plants and algae, anything that can do photosynthesis, take that energy and turn it into food. They turn it into basic sugars, glucose primarily, that other organisms can then consume to get that original sun energy. Now, some energy is lost in the process in the form of heat. So heat energy is given off by living things. All living things give off heat. I don't know if you're aware of that, but if you were to use a infrared camera to look for heat, to look for maybe something alive moving in the bushes, you'll find that the bushes themselves give off a little bit of that heat. So even plants emit a little bit of heat. So heat is lost. Consumers, so this would be, say, a cow grazing that's eating grass. That would be the primary consumer. He gives off heat too. That cow passes away, sadly, but circle of life, right? So his body decomposes, and the decomposers being bacteria, fungi, and there's some invertebrates that are involved as well, like worms. They're going to be breaking down the cow, and they also give off heat. So heat, as you can see, is lost a little bit in the process. What's left after something has decomposed are nutrients, basically, inorganic nutrients that are in the soil. And usually they make the soil really nice and rich so that more things can grow. And so the producers then can use that as their nutrient pool to grow from. So that's our little circle of life right there. So in an environment, instead of saying living and non-living, there's a couple of terms that biologists use. Biotic being one, so biotic means the living factors in the environment, and abiotic being the non-living factors in the environment. So biotic and abiotic factors. In a marine environment, here's some examples. Abiotic factors would be substrate. Substrate is just another word for the ground or the thing that something is anchored into, so sand, mud, rock. Waste input in the form of inorganic nutrients. So when something poops, a lot of that waste contains nitrates and phosphates, so that would be an abiotic factor. Sunlight, of course, is an important factor. The minerals and smaller elements that make up the water chemistry, the salinity of the water, the temperature of the water is another abiotic factor, pressure of the water, and then wind and current and waves. So these are all non-living factors that can have a big impact on the living things themselves. So biotic factors that we see, we have invasive species, native species, the waste coming from organisms. Of course, that kind of goes here into waste input as well, so there's some crossover. And the shell and bones and skeleton remains of organisms. So those would be, biotic factors is just stuff that comes from organisms or is organisms themselves, living things or their stuff. So because they all are kind of connected, sorry, I went down too far there. Because they're all kind of connected, they're actually kind of impossible to separate in terms of their effects on the evolution of living things. So living and non-living things affect each other pretty significantly. We've talked about an ecosystem. Within an ecosystem, there are many habitats. So that's a specific place in which an organism can be found. So for example, if we look at ocean ecosystems, coral reefs might be one habitat. The rocky shore might be another habitat. The hydrothermal vents would be another habitat. So you can find lots of different habitats within a single ecosystem. And they can even be divided down further if we want to look more closely at organisms into microhabitats. All of the factors, when we combine the biotic and the abiotic that make up an organism's habitat, affect its homeostasis. And that's just a term for its physiological balance. So you are in homeostasis, for example, when you have a body temperature of around 37 degrees Celsius, or that's about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. A blood pH level, 7.35 to 7.45. You're rested. You have proper kidney and pancreatic function. Those are all ways that you are in homeostasis. So organisms as well, they have like an ideal range where they are the most comfortable, just like you are. These are called optimal ranges. So that's the ideal range, say, of temperature. Let's use that as an example in this case. So this crab is going to have an ideal or optimum range of temperature, and too much is going to be too hot, or too little is going to be too cold. And then you have what are called a zone of stress on either side. So let's say we get a little bit too warm. He's in the zone of stress. He's in the orange. He's a little uncomfortable. Zone of intolerance is where the organism could potentially die because the temperature is too hot or too cold. So that's just one example of temperature, but that just gives you a sense of what the optimum range means. It means the best range in which an organism can function, whether we're talking about temperature or salinity or pressure. So some of these parameters in the environment, of course, sunlight, the source of energy for most things. In the case of the oceans, of course, we have phytoplankton. They're the largest group of photosynthetic producers. So these guys they're the primary producers in the ocean. They depend on the sun first and foremost. Believe it or not, most of the photosynthesis that takes place in the ocean is not done by plants. It is mostly done by algae and photosynthetic bacteria. So those are the things that are creating most of the oxygen in the ocean and most of the oxygen that we breathe, which is pretty amazing. So most of it comes from these guys, not from trees. So this will give you some examples of some different primary producers. Of course, they need to be kind of close to the surface of the ocean to be able to receive sunlight. So most of these have to be in shallow water, or in the case of phytoplankton, they drift pretty close to the surface. Temperature is another big one. So regulation of body temperature, most marine life are ectotherms, meaning that they don't generate their own body heat. So they depend exclusively on the outside temperature for their own body regulation. So that would include fish, all types of invertebrates. So fish, invertebrates. Actually, this is kind of funny because this picture includes a dinosaur, but dinosaurs were actually endotherms, believe it or not. They actually created their own body heat, so that's a little bit off. Most reptiles today, however, do not. Most reptiles are also ectotherms. So endotherms would be us, it would be other mammals and birds, pretty much. So endotherms generate their own body heat. Here's an example of an ectotherm. Here's a lizard. And if any of you guys have lizards or snakes as pets, you know that you have to have a heat lamp on their tank. And that's because they can't generate their own body heat. They need that heat externally coming from the heat lamp to keep them warm and to keep their metabolism going at the right rhythm, at the right speed. So what happens is if they get too cold, they get really sluggish. They slow down, and that's their metabolism not functioning properly because they don't have enough body heat. So thermoregulation is basically how an ectotherm absorbs or radiates heat in order to kind of maintain homeostasis. Of course, we thermoregulate too. We put on a warm jacket when it's cold outside, or we wear a tank top and shorts and flip-flops when it's really hot. So the term thermoregulation mostly applies to ectotherms, but it can apply to us a little bit too. Okay, so again, we've got temperature being a major factor in how an organism can metabolize, how they can turn food into energy in their bodies. Salinity is another big deal. That's the saltiness of water. Some organisms can tolerate more than others. And the term hypersaline refers to water that's overly salty, whereas hyposaline means not enough salt. So organisms have in the marine environment, organisms have a zone of tolerance here as well. There are some that love super salty environments, and those are halenophiles. So when you see the word haline in the future, which you will in this class, it's referring to saltiness of water. So in order to deal with water that's super salty, maybe an organism, so that it can have a wider zone of tolerance, has a really good method of osmosis. And osmosis is basically moving water across a membrane to deal with different concentrations of salt. So you put for example, you put a fish from salt water. If you put them in fresh water, it's going to have a really hard time dealing with being in water that's less salty than he's used to. And its body deals with this by taking in seawater. Osmosis is going to drive some of that water out of the fish's body. The gills will pump some of the solutes, some of the salt in and out. So they have ways of coping with water, with changes in water salinity. So you hear about fish that swim, they're marine fish, but they swim upriver to have babies and lay eggs. They have to be able to deal with changes in salinity. So another big one is pressure. So a lot of organisms can live in the deep, deep sea where there's insanely high pressure. Here's one example. About 3,700 meters deep, you have a pressure that's gone up to 370 atmospheres. That means 370 times the pressure that you're feeling right now if you're at sea level, or 2.7 tons per square inch. That is insanely high pressure. That would crush a soda can. That would crush a submarine potentially. So there's really amazing ways of dealing with that pressure. But basically the short answer is that they evolved down there. So soft-bodied organisms at these deep, extreme pressures are just really well adapted. They're just physically adapted. If you were to take them from the deep sea and bring them up to the surface, they would basically, their tissues would burst because the inside pressure of their body is so much higher than it is here at the surface. So we'll look here again, energy in the biosphere. So we'll just kind of trace the path. Of course, we start with primary producers, plants, algae, bacteria that can do photosynthesis. They take in sunlight. Consumers eat the primary producers. Then you have different levels of consumers. You have primary consumers, secondary, so big fish eats little fish, tertiary, and so on, until you have the top of the food chain, which would be, in the case of the ocean, that would be some sharks, but mostly whales and dolphins at the top of the food chain. And then, of course, humans at the top of the food chain. So it starts with the sun, and a little review of photosynthesis. We won't get into it too much because you've seen this before. But, oops, let me get back in the frame there. Okay. Photosynthesis has a pretty basic formula. You have sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, plus nutrients that plants take up through the soil. And it's converted into sugars and oxygen. Oxygen is the waste product for plants. So a couple more terms. Living things that can make their own energy are called autotrophs. So that would be plants and algae. And in the case of hydrothermal vents down here, that would be the bacteria that live in the gut of the tube worms. And this is pretty amazing. This is called chemosynthesis, this process. It's not photosynthesis, it's chemosynthesis. Photosynthesis is where you have sunlight, hence the word photo. Chemosynthesis, they use chemicals instead. So it's very similar to photosynthesis at the surface, but instead the vent fluid itself contains dissolved nutrients that these bacteria can metabolize. And then larger organisms eat the bacteria and so on. So you have this whole ecosystem. And what's so amazing about it is that it could go on no matter what the sun does. So the sun could go out or explode or something. This process could continue. So pretty amazing when we think about looking for life on other planets too. So in both cases, photosynthesis is turning inorganic chemicals into organic molecules. And so there's ways of studying the rate at which this occurs. And biologists that are interested in energy in ecosystems are interested in the total primary productivity of a system, and that's basically measuring the rate at which food is created by these organisms. So it's pretty incredible, and it's neat to be able to trace molecules through a system.